Does anyone really know what it means to be a related service provider?
Okay, this is where it all begins. I know when I first started as a speech language pathologist, it was so confusing to figure out what my role was. What's not language in a public school? It's all language. Language impacts, obviously, ELA, reading and writing skills, those are language skills, but it also impacts math and reading problems. It impacts social skills, emotional skills, behavioral skills. So I had a really hard time figuring out, what's not language and what's my role? And how does my role differ from the special education teacher's role, the general education teacher's role, the behaviorist's role? Those are really tricky things. And I think we have to start here. What is a related service? And how are we supposed to meet the requirements of the federal law? So we're going to start with what the federal law is, and we're going to go from there. So first we have to understand that related services fall under the IDEA. Now that's the federal law that says every student has the constitutional right to a free and appropriate public education. That's all students. That includes our general education students, of which special education students are a part. Remember, all students are general ed students. Some students also get special education. And related services in that federal law is defined as developmental, corrective, and other supportive services that are required, and we're going to talk about this a little later, it's not a benefit, but required for that student with the disability to benefit from special education. Some states will also add language that it's also for the child to benefit from general education, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what are our related services? So we as speech language pathologists, we are related service providers. Related services are also occupational and physical therapy, orientation and mobility, psychological services, counseling, social work, transportation falls under related services. This could also be teacher of the deaf, educational audiology. The one exception to this would be APE services. Adaptive physical ed is actually under special education, not a related service. So related services, like I alluded to earlier, are required to assist a child with a disability to receive a free and appropriate public education, make progress in the general curriculum, or benefit from special education. So if it's a child identified needing special education and they need our services to benefit from that service, then related services would be required. So it's really important to remember that the criteria is not that they can benefit, because all students would benefit from our services. I'm going to move myself up here. They're not eligible for rated services just because they benefit from them, because all students would benefit from them. So related services have to be educationally relevant, and they have to be necessary to either allow students to access their education or support their IEP goals. So it's really important that we remember that schools are not required to provide services that aren't essential to a student's education. As much as sometimes as we'd like to provide them, we're not required to do that unless they require that service to access their education. So if we're talking about unrelated therapy services that aren't educationally relevant, that is a service that is exclusive to that discipline, and it doesn't support the student's educational program. So this is really important when we start thinking about how we provide our services, how we assess for our services. Everything kind of connects to this. So we have to be able to show that our intervention supports their education program. So I want you to be thinking about that as we go through the rest of this presentation. So an unrelated therapy is a direct service, typically, provided in an isolated therapy setting. And I'm speaking from someone who works in public schools, so hear me out as I go through this. And this is a service that's focused on discipline-specific objectives. So sometimes what happens when we're in the schools is we complete the self, we find that the child is low on a couple of subtests, and we focus on those particular subtests, but we haven't connected that service back to what's happening in the classroom. That's what it means to focus on discipline-specific objectives. and to provide those services in my therapy room unrelated to what's happening in the classroom. So how do we determine whether or not a student needs related services in the school? So this all happens at our team meeting. So what often happens with us in the schools is I come in, I've done my report, my OT comes in, she's done her report. In some schools, the psychologist does the psychoeducational assessment, or maybe they've just done the cognitive testing, and then I have the teacher that does her testing and the educational assessment. And we each kind of have our pieces, and we say, well, this is my piece, and I say they qualify or they don't qualify. That's actually not what's in the regulation. So the federal regulation requires a team meeting be conducted as part of the eligibility process. Not one person can make the determination for services. So the evaluation is individualized based on that child's ability to participate in their education, whether it be curriculum related or socially or emotionally or behaviorally. We can use standardized measures or non-standardized measures. Again, that's in the federal regulation. For a student to receive related services, they have to have a skill deficit that impacts their educational performance and or their participation across school environments. So those recommendations and our evaluations should be looked at as one component of data along with all the other data by all the other service providers and considered by the team. So school-based therapy is not intended to replace outpatient services because how we look at those services and what's needed is different clinically versus educationally. So when I, as a public school clinician, am looking at a child and whether or not they need related services, I'm looking at it within the framework of the school. When I did private therapy for a rehab clinic, I was looking at their quality of life, and I was looking at different metrics under insurance umbrellas and their quality of life and activities of daily living as to whether or not they qualified for those services. But under the educational umbrella, my system of looking at their need is different. It's not the same as in a clinical setting. Even though I'm a clinician, I'm under the educational umbrella, and that's really important when we think about whether or not a child needs related services or our clinical services in an educational environment. So our focus as related service providers, speech pathologists in a school should be participation. Our services build a student's ability to participate. They're not meant to remediate a specific skill in isolation as SLPs in a public school. So when we think about service models and we're thinking about providing services to students, most to least restrictive, that top one is us providing services in our therapy room out of context of what they do in their daily lives. In context would be the next least restrictive. Consultation is kind of the middle of the road. Accommodations and then information sharing is the least restrictive for a student. So what does that collaborative team process look like when we're developing IEPs? So we sit at the team, everybody at the team reports their findings. We all look at and are supposed to review the data and kind of pull together the strengths and prioritize the needs. Now some teams might do this prior to a team meeting where everybody kind of plops their strengths and their weaknesses and their deficits into a shared document prior to a team meeting. Not that we're predetermining, but just so that we have some framework to all kind of look at a child's strengths together when we sit down as a team. Once we determine the child's strengths and what their areas of deficit and need are, and we determined eligibility, then we write prioritized goals. So the team determines what services and supports a student needs to be able to benefit from either special education or access the general education curriculum. And the team then is required through IDEA to determine the least restrictive environment to implement that plan. That means if we can provide those services through consultation with the teacher, that's least restrictive for that child, and that is what we should be proposing. If we can collaborate with a special education teacher and offer some supports and services so that the child can better access special education, then that is what we should do because it's least restrictive. So the team works collaboratively at the team meeting to determine who can most effectively address goals and how. Now, this is something that I used to really struggle with when I first started as a speech pathologist in the schools, because I was looking in an isolated way at my testing on this specific measure and then writing goals according to that test and not looking globally at what the child's needs were. So when you're sitting at a table and you determine that a child has specific needs related to comprehension, and you know that this is the comprehension deficit that the child has related to their vocabulary understanding, or maybe the struggle is in writing because they don't understand how to organize their writing. They don't understand categories and lists and how to kind of put writing together or summarize, and you want to teach them a framework. You can provide the information to the team. That doesn't necessarily mean you're the best person to provide that service. If there's an overlap in a child's needs, the team should be working collaboratively to decide what skills the child needs to be taught, and then who's going to be able to best address that goal in the least restrictive environment. If there's an overlap, the team decides who should be involved. More isn't always better, and we really have to remember that this is an actual child who has to follow a schedule, and the more integrated that we can be for that child, the more effective progress that they're going to make. For a child to have to travel to multiple different professionals and be taught different strategies by different people is really a disservice to a child who has a disability. So that's something we definitely want to avoid, and we want to work collaboratively and decide, okay, this is the skill deficit. Who's the best person on this team to meet that need? So why do we want to provide services in context? So the evidence and the research shows that collaborative services are as effective as traditional one-to-one services and better support a generalization of skills. Now, it's really important that we are comfortable and understand what this evidence shows, especially when we're communicating to families and we're communicating to teachers and we're building the relationships that we need to build in order to provide services in context. So related service providers, it's on us. We have to understand what student expectations are, and there's a whole host of skills that we need as related service providers to build relationships with general education teachers to better understand what they're trying to accomplish in their classrooms and what our students are expected to do based on the curriculum. We have to see if the strategies that we might be proposing are feasible, if they're meaningful, if they're going to work for a student. And when we're providing services in context, it allows us to problem solve and help support the teachers in what they're trying to accomplish in the classroom and really be in the moment to help bridge those pieces for our students. And that's really our role. Our role is to look through our speech pathologist lens at what's happening in the classroom and provide those bridges for our students between their skills and what they're expected to do in the curriculum, in the classroom, and in their communication context. So our rule of thumb is that we want to choose services in context first, whenever appropriate, because the law requires us to provide services in the least restrictive environment. If out of context services are needed, I mean, there are some skills that we definitely need to use principles of motor learning and teach a child with maybe more significant articulation errors or phonological deficit or an apraxia in order to use to practice so that they can be intelligible. Well, if we're going to do an out of the classroom, out of context therapy room service, we need to be planning for generalization right from the beginning because we want to make sure our student can transfer skills into the context as soon as possible. So remember, we're obligated to provide services in the manner that it's least disruptive to our students' education as related service providers. I hope this gave you some things to think about. I'd love to hear questions that you have. Please leave a comment below and let me know what you're thinking. What gets in the way of your ability to provide these less restrictive services? What questions do you have in your particular school? And please hit subscribe below. I'm going to be doing a next video on what the 3-1 model is, which is a model that I've been using to help me better understand what's happening for students in classrooms. You can find all my information in the description. Please hit subscribe. More videos will be coming to you every week.